Hi everyone, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Monday, the 20th, where we are talking about Lovecraft. Now that we've put some closure onto Dracula, as you know, last class I asked you to identify a quotation that you thought had some relevance or importance for Dracula. And while you're not required to respond to your classmates, you are required to read your classmates' responses. I am catching up on responding myself to the discussion forum questions. I should have returned paper number 1 to all of you who submitted in paper number 1 on time. So if it turns out that you have not submitted in, or you did submit in paper number 1 on time and you have not received it back, please let me know. And my hope is to get all caught up with everything in the next week or so. And by reading the Dracula quotations, I think you'll get a good sense of some of the major elements within the novel. But after I read your responses, I'll fill in anything that might be missing. But I wanted to move forward with Lovecraft. And one of the reasons why I wanted us to do Lovecraft is because of his very important essay, Supernatural Horror and Literature, which is how we began the semester, if you'll remember. And I thought it would be very useful to see some of Lovecraft's writing in at least relation to some of his thoughts and commentary about what makes good supernatural literature or what makes good Gothic literature. And we'll do the very same at the ending of the semester with Stephen King. We'll read just a couple of his short stories, but we'll see whether or not his writing lives up to some of the points that he made in Danse Macabre, which was also another important work that we started the semester with, defining Gothic and supernatural literature. So I selected 3 stories from H.P. Lovecraft, The Outsider, Pickman's Model, and The Dunwich Horror. And I had ordered a text that included those stories, but you can also see that I have included links to those specific 3 stories because the text I ordered has additional works by Lovecraft. And in terms of Lovecraft, I have to be honest, I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of Lovecraft. That said, my husband loves Lovecraft. But I think that he's certainly important in terms of the Gothic genre, if for no other reason because of his essay, Supernatural Horror and Literature. As we know, just from reading that particular essay, he is an Anglophile. He tries to mimic English or British inflections and language, and I think you see that in his short stories. And that said, I think that his background in some ways is almost parallel in some ways to Poe's background, which was also very troubling and or troubled. And as we know, Lovecraft had a great affinity for Edgar Allan Poe. Lovecraft was in poor health and had a family history of dementia, and also from New England, and would oftentimes write about New England decadence. We definitely get the sense of arrogance and superiority, dare I even say racism, with Lovecraft, especially when you start reading some of his short stories. He was, at least by biographical accounts, changing some of his viewpoints as he aged. So that said, I don't know what that would mean if he had continued to write after his viewpoints had changed, but I think you definitely see his racism and sexism. These are very male-centric pieces in his works. Most of his stories were published in Weird Tales magazines, and he tends to straddle the science fiction and the horror genre. And his fame came after death, which is not unusual for authors, becoming a kind of cult figure in many respects. He created his own mythos and his own environment, almost like when you think about something like the Lord of the Rings, by creating an entire world, in effect. There is a sense of realism to Lovecraft. He liked to use real locations and mix them with this mythos that he created. Part of the fun of reading Lovecraft, if you're a New Englander, is that you will recognize many of the places that he references. In fact, in one of his short stories, we're not reading that particular short story, he even talks about a train stopping in Greenfield, Massachusetts. So again, it's the idea is that this gives a sense of authenticity to his writing, because if you know these real locales, then it isn't too much of a stretch of the imagination to assume that things like Miskatonic University, for instance, which is modeled after Harvard, exist. Part of his mythos includes not just Miskatonic University, but the Necronomicon, a very famous novel or a very famous book of spellcraft and black magic that supposedly is housed in the Miskatonic University. And there are all kinds of folklore stories about individuals actually looking for the Necronomicon, that it was presented in such a realistic fashion that people actually think that it exists and can be found. Part of his mythos is Cthulhu, and it is something that's not supposed to be able to be pronounced with the human tongue. So this is the closest that I suppose we could get to pronouncing it. Cthulhu, this great mythological monster. We definitely see in Lovecraft this preoccupation with old things and astronomy. And we oftentimes see narrators who are scientists and scholars who are delving into the unknown. But again, I think the biggest issue with Lovecraft, or at least one of my biggest issues with Lovecraft, is this anti-foreign, xenophobic sentiment that he expresses in his works. And I'm the first to admit that sometimes, while his works are Poe-inspired, they don't necessarily hold to the literary quality of Poe. That's not to say that Lovecraft doesn't try. He gives us twist endings as Poe does, but Lovecraft is very clear to put those twist endings in italics. Again, not having a lot of faith in the reader, and that we would need to have that twist ending basically revealed to us in italics. You do see, though, dramatic tension and some foreshadowing and some prose rhythms. And that said, I'm actually a fan of the first story, The Outsider. I think it's perhaps the most literary of the three works that I had assigned. We have an opening quote from Keats, after all, and Keats being a great romantic poet. We have the use of an I narrator, which was a very Poe-like technique that, of course, Lovecraft was trying to mimic. We know that Lovecraft is utilizing things like atmosphere associated with the Gothic. The story is about seemingly a castle at twilight with a full moon. We get references to isolation. We always know that isolation is a bad thing in the world of the Gothic. Graveyards. And this twist ending in italics, so I hope I'm not giving anything away at this point, where we find out that the monstrosity is indeed the narrator himself. The narrator is the other, or the outsider. What it turns out to be is that the narrator is dead but still has consciousness, that in and of itself might evoke an enormous amount of fear from the reader. What happens if you were to die but still have consciousness, and how would you be treated in the land of the living? The castle we're introduced to is not a castle. It happens to be a crypt, and basically the narrator is able to crawl his way out of the crypt and go to the land of living, and they're all responding with horror. It almost reminds me of the Mask of the Red Death in terms of disrupting a party. And this is Death, our narrator. And of course, he sees his visage in a reflection, getting to that idea of doubling that's so common within the Gothic, and talks about in the end about how he basically is going to be condemned to being an other or outsider, and only others that are in his predicament can accept him. I can't help but think of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in some respects. Pickman's model is a piece that I think very much reinforces this long tradition of mixing art with the Gothic tradition and the supernatural. If we had time, we would have read The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. It's a great piece. But this linking of art and the supernatural, I think, is done in a much more straightforward way, and if nothing else, a much more concise way. I'm well aware that we finished Dracula, our longest read of the semester, and that hopefully at this point you are in the midst of The Haunting of Hill House, and that you're finding it to be an easier read. Certainly it's shorter and it's more contemporary. But I didn't want to overwhelm us by adding something with the length and the complexity of the picture of Dorian Gray. So Pickman's model is going to have to suffice. This takes place in Boston. Again, part of the fun of reading Lovecraft is that he utilizes real places to set his fictional world in reality. We once again have an I narrator, Thurber, who maintains that he's sane. This should be reminiscent of Edgar Allan Poe, or the very little that we read of Edgar Allan Poe. But in this instance, we do have a sane narrator. That's the thing about Lovecraft, is that in all of the other authors we've read, there's been ambiguity. There is no ambiguity in Lovecraft. Supernatural does exist. And we learn about an ancient evil. And of course, Lovecraft is going to give us all kinds of associations with the supernatural by referencing things like Salem and witches and vampirism, and talking a little bit about the suspension of nature's laws, which is what the supernatural really is. This idea of the possibility of reverse evolution, that should bring memories back of things like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And of course, Lovecraft would have been well versed in all of these previous Gothic texts. And he was very well read, as you could see from his essay, Supernatural Horror and Literature. So he's taking bits and pieces and basically making them his own, which is something that Stephen King does as well, very frequently. If you know anything about Stephen King's novel Pet Sematary, then you know it's just a modern retelling of Monkey's Paw. Monkey's Paw being the English ghost story, the British ghost story that we examined for Halloween by Jacobs. The twist ending, again, is in italics, and that it turns out that our narrator ultimately finds a photograph, and that photograph proves that Pickman's models are actually models from life, not of his imagination. Models of all kinds of monstrosities. Notice how Pickman is very much like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, this idea of having two residences and two personas. And then we end up with the Dunwich Horror. Of course, this is part of the Cthulhu mythos, which is quite complex. But I wanted to give you just a little bit of a taste. The opening quote in the Dunwich Horror gives a sense of archetypes. There is this idea in Lovecraft that there is this sort of genetic predisposition towards evil. Notice how it's divided in multiple sections. That said, this is the longest of the 3 short stories that we're reading. That takes place in north central Massachusetts in this fictional town of Dunwich, but with references to other towns, of course, that do exist. And we are introduced to one of these scholarly figures, again, Dr. Armitage, in many ways like a Van Helsing figure, if you want to think about Dracula. We're now at the part of the semester where we can make reference to earlier Gothic texts and how they influence some of the more contemporary Gothic authors. And this embracing of both the scientific as well as the supernatural. And one quote that I wanted to bring to your attention, and this is in the 5th section in the notes below, is about the Dunwich Horror, is that the natives are repellently decadent in a path of retrogression, which you see in many New England backwaters. Again, that's part of the racism that Lovecraft was well known for, as he talks about inbreeding and degeneracy and decadence. Not that we didn't talk about some of this with Poe as well. I can't help but think about something like The Fall of the House of Usher. And the idea of abnormality. Not only is Miskatonic supposed to parallel Harvard University, but there's references to the Arkham Advertiser, which is supposed to parallel the Boston Globe, that there have been newspaper articles about the decadence that exists. And again, Lovecraft is going to make reference to supernatural and pagan elements whenever possible. Things like Halloween and May Eve and black magic. Making reference, of course, to the Necronomicon, which is a book of ancient evil, of course, part of the mythology of Miskatonic University. And using some folklore as well. The whippoorwill, for instance, has some folklore associated with it, that it is the harbinger of death. Just like we talked about the folklore associated with salt, that salt is about purification. So that when you've got a Dr. Jekyll and a Mr. Hyde, specifically a Dr. Jekyll, using impure salt, it's one of the reasons why perhaps his experiment goes awry. And also from a plot device, he's not able to duplicate that particular experiment. The common Lovecraftian question that we see, and we're reading only 3 of his short stories, and many of his short stories really are much more in the realm of science fiction. I deliberately chose stories that were more in the realm of the supernatural. But the common Lovecraftian question is, who or what is the monster? And we are, unlike other Gothic texts, given detailed description of monstrosity. We saw this with our previous 2 stories, but perhaps best illustrated in the Dunwich Horror. We're told about green ichor. I can tell you that Lovecraft likes his green ichor. That's a description he oftentimes uses. Something that's partly human but partly non-human, with this leathery hide and this greenish gray tentacle or tentacles. And then in the 7th section, we get a diary entry, and this should be reminding you of the epistolary novel, and very much an homage, I think, that Lovecraft is giving us to the epistolary technique. We get 3 male scientists. Again, this is very much a very male-centric world in Lovecraft. These scientists represent different ages, old, middle age, and young. And in fact, 3, as we've talked about before, is oftentimes an important number for Trinity and Christianity, which is supposed to basically battle in the face of black magic. And we find out that Wilbur Whately is not at all the real monster. That's the twist in this story. He's got a twin brother who's much more evil. Notice this idea of twinning or doubling, the doppelganger that we've become accustomed to in the Gothic. And the moral, if there is a moral, is we have no business calling in such things from the outside. And only very wicked people and very wicked cults ever try to. Lovecraft oftentimes talks about multiple dimensions that can be accessed through things like angles. Keep that in mind when we're reading The Haunting of Hill House and the dangers of accessing those other dimensions. Now, The Haunting of Hill House is very different. It's known for its subtlety. It reminds me very much of The Monkey's Paw. Not that Shirley Jackson was British, she's American, but I think she was very much mimicking some of the conventions of the English ghost story. And once again, I was able to find a link for this, and we'll also talk about movie adaptations as well. But for our attendance question, and this will be due on Wednesday, the 22nd, is I wanted to bring us back to the very beginning of the semester where we were talking about Lovecraft's essay, Supernatural Horror and Literature. And if you'll remember, what he said in his essay is that the best horror tales have naturalness, convincingness, artistic smoothness, skillful artistry with technique, craftsmanship, experience, psychological knowledge, exotic atmosphere, and a supernatural element. So, I know you've read only 3 of Lovecraft's short stories, The Outsider, Pickman's Model, and The Dunwich Horror, but at least based on those 3, do you think these pieces illustrate those specific elements, and why or why not? So, if you haven't read Lovecraft yet, that's your assignment, to finish reading Lovecraft so that you can respond to this question as we put closure onto Lovecraft and then begin with The Haunting of Hill House. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about, well, hauntings as well as other Gothic elements. Take care. Bye-bye.